Welcome back, everyone. We've got a wild one today. Buckle up because we're diving into some pretty crazy financial news stories. AI is shaking things up for creatives, trade wars are getting hot, and even some surprising shakeups in tech and social media.
Yeah, there's a lot to cover, so let's jump right in.
Okay, first up, this story really gets you thinking about the future of writing and what it means to be creative. A tech journalist, get this, she got a gift, a book titled Tech-Splaining for Dummies. But here's the catch.
It was written completely by AI.
And it gets even weirder.
The AI was trained on the journalist's actual work, her writing style. And the book, it sounds just like her.
Yeah, it's freaky. Makes you think, can anyone really own their style anymore when a machine can just copy it like that? The journalist said she was amused, but also a little worried.
And this is a much bigger issue than just one weird book, right? This throws gas on the fire of the AI ethics debate, especially when it comes to intellectual property. Like, if AI can make art that's basically the same as a human's, who owns the rights?
Totally. And it gets even more complicated when you think about how these AI programs learn. They're fed huge amounts of art and writing that's already out there, and a lot of times the creators have no idea it's happening.
Remember that AI song that sounded exactly like Drake in The Weeknd?
Oh, yeah.
It went viral, but it also raised some serious red flags about copyright and whether AI is basically making money off someone else's talent.
And now the UK government is thinking about changing copyright laws to let AI companies use stuff online without even asking the people who made it.
Yeah, can you imagine what that would do to artists and writers who are trying to make a living? And it's not much clearer over here in the US either. President Trump got rid of that AI order Biden put in place, so nobody's really sure what the rules are anymore.
Plus, OpenAI is getting sued left and right by big names like the New York Times and a bunch of artists. They're worried about fair use and that AI could just become a plagiarism machine.
Feels like the Wild West out there right now with AI, everyone trying to figure out how to play the game while the game is changing. It's not just legal stuff either. It's a global power struggle. Who controls this tech?
Exactly. Speaking of power struggles, let's move on to trade because things are really starting to heat up. President Trump announced he's putting a 25% tariff on things coming in from Canada and Mexico. It starts February 1st.
And here's the thing. Those tariffs, they might include oil, too. We get tons of oil from Canada, so this could mean gas prices go way up.
Oh, man. So businesses are going to feel it, and so are we, right?
Yeah.
Prices on everything could go up. It's like a domino effect.
And then what happens?
Yeah.
What if Canada and Mexico hit back with their own tariffs? We could be headed for a full-on trade war.
And this is all happening on top of the tariffs Trump wants to put on Chinese goods, which could be as high as 60%. Remember a couple of weeks ago when China was saying they wanted a win-win?
Seems like we're moving farther away from that every day.
Yeah, no kidding. Speaking of tricky situations, let's talk about Brexit. It's been 5 years since the UK left the EU, and the results are, well, mixed.
Mixed is a good way to put it.
Let's break it down, starting with trade. How's that going?
Not great. All those non-tariff barriers, basically a ton of paperwork and red tape, they've made it a pain for UK businesses to trade with the EU. Especially for smaller businesses, they're getting hit hard.
The UK has signed some new trade deals with other countries, but has it been enough to make up for what they lost by leaving the EU? I mean, has Brexit actually been good or bad for their economy overall?
It's hard to say. The effects have been different for different industries and parts of the UK, and then you have to figure out how to even measure what Brexit costs them. It's a debate. But one thing's for sure, it's been a crazy ride.
A crazy ride is right. And it's not just trade that's been affected. Immigration has changed a lot too, hasn't it?
Absolutely. Less people are coming from the EU, but more are coming from other countries, mainly because of work visas and people studying abroad.
And if you're thinking about taking a trip between the UK and the EU, get ready for some headaches. They're both putting in new travel systems this year, so expect more paperwork and longer wait times.
And then there's the whole legal thing. It's actually pretty interesting.
Oh, yeah.
The UK, they kept most of the EU laws, but decided they could change them whenever they wanted to.
Which they've already started doing. They changed some tax laws, like adding VAT to private schools and getting rid of it for things like tampons. So Brexit has given them more freedom to do what they want with their laws.
Yeah, remember that whole 350 million a week thing they said they were sending to the EU?
Oh, yeah.
Totally made up. But they are saving money by not paying into the EU budget anymore. They even rejoined that Horizon research program, which is a big deal for scientists working together.
So money-wise, it's kind of a wash. They save some, they lose some. And politics. still a mess. The Labour Party is trying to make things better with the EU, but Brexit is far from over.
You can say that again. Speaking of things that are far from over, let's move over to social media. Remember when Elon Musk took over Twitter and renamed it X?
Oh yeah, and everyone thought there would be this mass exodus, like everyone would leave.
Well, it's still happening. Brands are getting more and more worried about what's going on with X, especially all the hate speech and Musk's own controversial stuff.
And it's not just talk. Some big names have already left. The German soccer team, FC St. Pauli, said they were out because of the hate speech and Musk's politics. And even BMW in the UK decided they'd rather put their money on Facebook and Instagram.
Those are some pretty big names to lose. But for some, it's not so easy to just leave.
Right.
Like the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, they use X for things like customer service updates and telling people about delays and stuff. For them, X is still really important.
So it's a tough choice, weighing ethics against what they need to actually do their jobs.
Exactly. It just shows how hard it is for businesses in this whole social media world that's changing so fast. It's not just about how many people you can reach anymore. It's about what your brand stands for and making sure you're not putting yourself at risk.
So true. Now, let's talk about a brand that's facing its own challenges. Apple. They got all this new AI stuff. But iPhone sales actually went down at the end of last year.
Yeah, it looks like people aren't rushing to upgrade their phones like Apple thought they would. People are keeping their phones longer. And even the new AI stuff isn't enough for everyone.
Plus, their sales in China are way down, and that's a huge market for them.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole tariff thing on Chinese goods. Who knows what'll happen with that?
It's like a perfect storm of bad news for Apple. And don't forget, they had to shut down their AI news feature for a bit because it was giving people wrong information. Not exactly what you want from your fancy new AI.
It's not a great look. But it wasn't all bad for Apple. A lot of people with older iPhones did upgrade to the newer models, which is good. And their overall sales actually went up, thanks to their computers and all those services they offer.
Yeah, those services like Apple TV and Apple Pay, they're doing really well. But experts are saying Apple needs to keep innovating and really push the AI stuff if they want to stay on top.
Speaking of staying on top, let's talk about something that's super important but kind of behind the scenes. Open source software. And guess what? It's facing a crisis that could affect all of us.
The problem is the people who built open source software, they're getting older.
Ah, I see.
And no one's really sure who's going to take over when they retire.
That's scary. It's like relying on volunteers to keep the internet running. I mean, we all use open source software, but who's going to make sure it keeps working?
It's tough to get younger people excited about it. A lot of it is unpaid work, and you have to know these older computer languages that aren't really cool anymore.
So it's a generational thing and a technology thing all at the same time. So are there any solutions? What's being done to fix this?
Well, there are a few ideas out there. Some projects are being given to foundations to manage. Others, like this one called Curl, are choosing to stay independent. But the main thing is we got to find a way to support the next generation of open source people.
It's definitely something we should be talking more about. Open source software is so important. Now, for our next story, we're heading to a place that's been in the news a lot lately. Greenland.
Greenland.
Yeah. It's not usually a big financial news story, but things are changing.
What's going on up there?
Turns out Greenland has a ton of natural resources that everyone wants.
Like what?
We're talking rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt stuff that's super important for all our gadgets and electric cars. And since China controls most of the rare earth metals right now, everyone else is looking for new places to get them.
Ah, I see.
So Greenland is right in the middle of this global competition for resources. China, the US, everyone wants a piece of the action. But what about Greenland? What does this mean for them?
That's a great question, and it's complicated. On one hand, they could really boost their economy, create jobs, and not have to rely on Denmark as much. But then there's the whole environmental issue. Mining can be really destructive.
And we have to think about the people who live there too, the indigenous population, making sure they benefit and their culture is protected. It's a tough balance.
Absolutely. Trying to grow the economy without hurting the environment or people, it's not easy.
It's a dilemma we see all over the world. Speaking of dilemmas, let's take a break from all the serious stuff and talk about wine. Because even the wine world has its own drama going on.
Wine drama. I'm intrigued.
There's this French winemaker, Maxime Chapoutier, and his new wines are actually illegal to sell in France.
Illegal? Now I gotta know what's so bad about these wines.
Get this. He's mixing grapes from France and Australia. And in France, they're super serious about their wine. They believe that where the grapes are grown, the soil, the climate, it all makes a huge difference in how the wine tastes.
Right, the terroir.
Exactly. So for them, mixing grapes from different parts of the world is like a crime against wine.
Hmm,
But if they're illegal in France, how is he selling them at all?
that's a good question.
Brexit, that's how.
Phew.
The UK left the EU, so they don't have to follow those strict French rules anymore. So Chapoutier can sell his mixed up wines in the UK, no problem.
So Brexit accidentally created a whole new market for wine. That's pretty wild. But why is this guy mixing grapes from all over? What's his reasoning?
Well, he thinks it will make wine less intimidating for people who don't know all the fancy French stuff.
Yeah.
Plus, he says it could help with climate change. If one area has a bad year for grapes, you could use grapes from somewhere else.
That's actually pretty clever. He's going against tradition, but for reasons that make sense.
Yep.
But I bet the old school French winemakers are not happy about this.
You got that right. They think it's going to ruin everything, lead to cheap, bad wine everywhere. Others are worried it will destroy the whole idea of terroir. It's a battle between the old ways and the new ways, and who knows who will win.
Definitely something to think about the next time you're enjoying a glass of wine.
Absolutely. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're diving into some important economic news here in the U.S. Stay tuned.
Welcome back, everybody. Let's zoom in on what's happening with the U.S. economy. The latest numbers, well, they're showing things are slowing down a bit. Growth was only 2.3% last quarter, down from 3.1% before that.
Not exactly the kind of news that gets investors excited. What's going on? Is a recession coming?
Whoa, hold on. Not a recession yet, but there are definitely some problems. Trade and investments are down, and then we had those awful hurricanes last fall. Those had a big impact. Plus, all those labor strikes in different industries, that didn't help either.
And then you have President Trump, right? His economic policies are all over the place, especially those tariffs we talked about earlier. It's making everyone nervous, businesses and regular people like us.
Yeah, those tariffs are like a big question mark hanging over everything. It's tough to plan for the future when you don't know what's going to happen. They're affecting everything, from how much it costs to make stuff to how much we spend at the store.
But at least people are still spending, right? That's got to be good news.
It is, but the big question is for how long? What happens if those tariffs really hit hard? People might start holding on to their money, and that could cause a chain reaction that hurts the whole economy.
So we just got to wait and see. Keep an eye on things. Now let's jump back to social media for a second, because things are still crazy over at Elon Musk's X, formerly known as Twitter.
Yep, brands are still jumping ship, and I don't blame them. Musk is so unpredictable, and X just can't seem to get rid of all the hate speech. It's just too risky for a lot of companies.
Yeah, they don't want their brand associated with all that negativity. We saw big names like that German soccer team, FC St. Pauli, and even BMW in the UK say, see ya. They were worried about the hate speech and Musk's political views.
When brands that big start walking away, it sends a message. They're basically saying the risks of being on X are bigger than any benefits.
But for some organizations, leaving X isn't so simple. Like the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, they use X to give real-time updates to their customers and let people know about delays and all that. They still need X to do their job.
It's a tough situation. They got to balance their morals with actually being able to function. It just shows you how complicated this whole social media world is these days.
It's not just about getting your name out there anymore. It's about doing the right thing and making sure your company is on the right platform. Now, let's talk about Apple for a minute. They're usually on top of things, but even they've had some hiccups lately.
Yeah, they had all this hype about their new AI features, but iPhone sales actually went down last quarter.
Really? That's surprising. Apple's usually ahead of the curve. What happened? Did people just not care about the AI stuff?
It seems like people are holding onto their phones longer than they used to. Upgrading isn't as exciting as it used to be, even with fancy new AI. And then you have Apple's own problems on top of that.
Right, like sales in China are way down, and that's a big market for them. And who knows what's going to happen with those tariffs on Chinese goods.
Those tariffs could really mess things up for Apple, their supply chain, their costs, everything. And that means we might end up paying more for their products. Oh, and remember that AI news thing they had? They had to shut it down because it was giving people the wrong information.
Oops. Not a good look for their AI plans. But it wasn't all bad news for Apple, right? Didn't a lot of people with older iPhones upgrade?
They did. And their overall sales actually went up thanks to their computers and all those services they offer, like Apple TV and Apple Pay.
So those services are becoming a bigger part of their business. But the experts are saying if Apple wants to stay ahead of the game, they got to keep innovating, especially with AI. They can't let companies like Samsung and Google catch up. Speaking of staying ahead, let's talk about something that's super important, but most people don't even think about it. Open source software. And get this, it's in trouble. And that could be bad news for all of us.
You're talking about the people who create open source software, right? They're getting older, and there aren't enough young people to take their place.
Yeah, it's kind of scary when you think about it. It's like we're relying on volunteers to keep the internet running. We all use open source software, but who's going to maintain it in the future?
And it's not an easy sell to young people. It's often unpaid work, and a lot of it uses older programming languages that nobody's really learning anymore.
So it's a generational problem and a technology problem at the same time. Are people trying to fix this?
There are a few ideas floating around. Some projects are being handed over to foundations to manage, while others, like the Curl project, are staying independent. But the bottom line is we need to find ways to support the next generation of open source developers.
Absolutely. It's something we should all be paying attention to. Now, for our next story, we're heading to a place that's been making headlines. Greenland.
Greenland! What's going on up there? It's not exactly a financial hub, is it?
It wasn't, but things are changing. Greenland is sitting on a treasure trove of natural resources that everyone wants.
Really? Like what?
We're talking rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt, the stuff they use to make smartphones and electric cars. And since China controls most of the rare earth metals right now, other countries are desperate to find new sources.
So Greenland is suddenly in the spotlight.
Exactly. It's become this strategic prize in the global race for resources. But what does this mean for Greenland itself?
Well, on one hand, it could be huge for their economy. They could create jobs, become less dependent on Denmark, all that good stuff. But then there's the environmental impact. Mining can be really damaging.
And we have to think about the people who live there, the indigenous population. Will they benefit or will they be pushed aside? It's a classic dilemma, balancing economic growth with protecting the environment and respecting local communities.
It's a story we've heard before, but it's playing out in a new and interesting way in Greenland.
Speaking of interesting, let's take a little detour to the world of wine. Because even wine has its own drama these days.
Wine drama. I'm all ears.
There's this French winemaker, Maxime Chapoutier, and his new wines are causing quite a stir. In fact, they're illegal to sell in France.
Illegal wine. That's a new one. What's so scandalous about these wines?
He's blending grapes from France and Australia.
Fasp.
I know, right? It's practically sacrilege in France. They're obsessed with terroir, the idea that where the grapes are grown makes all the difference in the taste of the wine.
Yeah, I know about terroir. So mixing grapes from different continents, that's like breaking a sacred rule. But if it's illegal in France, how is he selling these wines at all?
Brexit. The UK is no longer part of the EU, so they don't have to follow those French wine rules. So Chapoutier is selling his blended wines in the UK, no problem.
So Brexit accidentally created a loophole for rebellious winemakers. That's pretty funny. But what's this guy's deal? Why is he mixing grapes from different parts of the world?
Well, he says it makes wine less intimidating for people who aren't wine snobs like me. And he also thinks it could help with climate change. If one region has a bad year, you can use grapes from another region.
That's actually a really interesting point. He's challenging tradition, but for reasons that make sense.
Yeah, he's thinking about the future of wine in a changing world. But the traditional French winemakers are not happy about it. They think he's going to ruin everything, flood the market with cheap, bad wine.
It's a battle between the old guard and the new guard. Tradition versus innovation. It's a question of what makes a good wine and who gets to decide.
Exactly. It's a debate that's probably going to go on for a while. But now, let's circle back to the U.S. economy because things are getting a little shaky.
Yeah, growth has definitely slowed down. It dipped to 2.3% last quarter, down from 3.1% the quarter before that.
So are we headed for a recession? What's causing this slowdown?
Well, it's not a recession yet, but there are definitely some warning signs. Trade and investment have been weak, and then we had those hurricanes that did a lot of damage. Plus, all the labor strikes in different industries haven't helped either. And then, of course, there's the uncertainty around President Trump's economic policies, particularly those tariffs we talked about earlier.
It's a lot to worry about. But at least consumer spending has been holding up pretty well.
That's true, but the question is, for how long? If those tariffs start to really affect prices, people might start cutting back on their spending, and that could have a domino effect on the whole economy. So we're kind of in a wait-and-see mode right now.
It's a nail-biter for sure. Let's go back to social media one last time. All that drama with Elon Musk and X, it's not over yet. Brands are still ditching the platform.
Yeah, Musk just can't seem to stay out of trouble, can he? And X is still struggling with all that hate speech. It's just not a good look for brands, especially the ones that care about, having a good reputation.
We've seen some pretty big names walk away, like FC St. Pauli, that German soccer team,
Yeah.
and BMW in the UK. They said they were out because of the hate speech and Musk's politics. It's a sign that brands are starting to put their money where their mouth is, taking a stand against platforms that don't share their values.
Totally. It's not just about getting your name out there anymore. It's about being associated with the right things.
But for some, leaving X isn't so easy. Remember the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority? They use X for all their service updates and stuff.
Yeah.
They kind of need it to do their job.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Balancing what's right with what's practical, not an easy choice. It shows how complicated this whole social media thing has become.
Totally agree. Now let's hop across the pond to the UK. 5 years since Brexit, can you believe it?
5 years already. Time flies.
It feels like we've been talking about Brexit forever. So much has happened, and it's still not over.
One of the biggest changes has been in trade between the UK and the EU. All those extra rules and paperwork, the non-tariff barriers, they call them, they've made it a real headache for UK businesses, especially the small ones.
The UK has made some new trade deals with other countries, but have those been enough to replace what they lost by leaving the EU? Has Brexit actually been good or bad for their economy? It's the million-dollar question.
It's hard to say. It really depends on who you ask and what part of the UK you're looking at. And even figuring out how to measure the impact of Brexit, that's a whole debate in itself. But one thing's for sure, it's been a wild ride.
A wild ride for sure. And immigration has changed a lot too, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Fewer people coming from the EU, but more coming from other countries, mainly for work or to study.
And if you're thinking about a trip between the UK and EU anytime soon, get ready for a paperwork party. Both sides are putting in new travel systems this year, so expect more forms and longer wait times.
And then there's the legal stuff. It's actually pretty interesting. The UK kept most of the EU laws, but decided they could change them whenever they want.
Right, like adding that VAT to private school fees and getting rid of it for things like tampons. Brexit gave them the power to make those changes.
And remember that whole thing about the UK sending $350 million a week to the EU?
Oh, yeah.
Turns out that was a load of, well, let's just say it wasn't true, but they are saving money by not being part of the EU anymore. They even rejoined that Horizon research program, which is great for scientific collaborations.
So financially, it's a mixed bag. Wins and losses. And politically, still a hot mess. The Labour Party wants to improve things with the EU, but the Brexit saga is far from over.
That's for sure. The next chapter is still being written.
Well, that's a wrap for today's show. We covered a lot. From rebellious winemakers and AI gone wild to economic slowdowns and the never-ending Brexit saga. It's a crazy world out there, and it's changing faster than ever. The key is to stay informed, stay curious, and don't be afraid to ask questions. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time for more financial adventures.